In the advanced West, we tend to think of civil wars as the stuff of history books or of faraway lands, waged between people of whom we know nothing. But Professor David Betz believes that we should get used to thinking of our own societies as near to the kind of intertribal conflict and organised violence that we instinctively associate with a more benighted past and a more volatile third world. Anyone familiar with the relevant literature, he says, would be unwise to bet against civil war coming to the West. Will this prediction be vindicated? Who would be doing the fighting? And perhaps most importantly, whose side would our leaders take? David Betz is a professor of war in the modern world at King's College London and has been kind enough to welcome me into his office. Professor David Betz, welcome to The Forge.
Thank you very much.
In a recent viral paper of yours, you write, and I quote, "It can be said that a generation ago, all Western countries could still be described as to a large degree cohesive nations, each with a greater or lesser sense of collective identity. By contrast, all now are incohesive political entities, jigsaw puzzles of competing identity-based tribes, living in large part in virtual segregation, in virtually segregated communities, competing over diminishing societal resources, increasingly obviously and violently." Now, few would disagree with that, certainly in Britain and indeed in much of Western Europe. But why should this point to civil war as such, which is of course what you are now notorious for having predicted, as opposed to, say, mere decline, greater misery, accelerating third worldification until Britain and much of Western Europe comes to resemble somewhere like, say, South Africa or Brazil?
I think that's a possibility. Whether it's South Africanization or Balkanization, or essentially a diminishment of civil life in the territory of the political entity heretofore known as Britain, into something akin to South Africa or indeed other highly fractured, rather dangerous places. I think that's a possibility. Why I've chosen the term civil war, I should perhaps go into. I use the term civil war in a fairly, I think, strict definitional sense as referring to a conflict, a form of conflict in which the belligerents, whether two or more belligerents, were both under the same sovereign authority at the outbreak of the conflict. There are, of course, a range of types of civil war contingencies that might fit under that definition. My suspicion is that what we're trending towards, most likely, should it occur, which I think is a very strong likelihood, if not necessarily an inevitability. Clever people might find that some political off-ramp for us, but I don't see any such clever people in the public sphere at the moment. So what I think is the most likely eventuality in British context is actually something more like Ulsterization. Mm-hmm. Think of the troubles in Northern Ireland, in probably most specifically the period in the early 1970s, with that level of intercommunal violence. Now, why not the South Africa model? Because Britain's not South Africa. It doesn't have that same demographic. In that particular case, you have the reversal of the majority-minority role, which is, I think, a very obvious and significant factor. But in many respects, yes, I mean, South Africa may be very telling in terms of what to expect in the future, in terms of the default level of guardedness of individual life or even of neighborhood life. So one will find, for example, as I've done in much of my previous research, which was on, a part of which is on essentially the refortification of urban spaces. A lot of that focused on South Africa, and you see, for example, neighborhood defense associations essentially emerging on a voluntary basis, but with a fairly high degree of organization and sophistication, essentially to fortify communities in an effort to maintain some sort of some potential for normal civil life to occur within what effectively become special sovereign zones within the larger community. That might be a pattern that is followed in the UK and elsewhere. But just to say that all things are not equal. Our demographic situation doesn't look like South Africa's, and it doesn't quite look like Bosnia's either. It has its own potentiality. For parallels to what might be expected, I've said Northern Ireland is an obvious one. It's analogous. It's also accessible to British people because it's within the historical memory of many British people. It's close by. You can kind of imagine that. It's in our culture, in our literature, in film, and so on. So it's a good possible example. Another one is Colombia. Colombia is a country that effectively has had a half century of low-grade civil war. Or indeed what is usually referred to in the literature as dirty wars. Dirty wars are a form of civil war, but which doesn't feature large-scale military maneuvers by uniform entities. It's much more complicated than that. And so the conflict tends to feature instead tit-for-tat assassinations, kidnappings, death squads, one-way helicopter rides into the ocean blue.
Very much a South America.
The South America style situation. So there are a number of patterns which might be followed. My guess is, of course it's my guess. Call it an informed guess, but my best guess is that we have something first that looks a bit like a dirty war, but then it metastasizes into something larger as you get increasingly large-scale population movements, and the cities become increasingly feral. I won't necessarily go into that term now, but just to suffice to say, they become increasingly abnormal and unlivable. And that is a result of predictable strategic actions which will be taken in the form of this larger conflict. So you might start with something that looks a bit like Northern Ireland in terms of its scale, but then metastasizes over time into something larger. If we're lucky, it stays at about Northern Ireland level, which if you scale that up to the whole of the UK, probably comes to, given our current population, would be maybe about 23,000 dead per year. Right, so worst year in Northern Ireland was 500 dead in a rather smaller population. So if you just scale that up to a country that is probably plus 70 million. Now, I mean, the government thinks it still insists it's somewhere in the mid-60s, but I think we all understand that it's not. They don't know, in fact, how many people are in the country, and it's almost certainly considerably larger than that. So that's my best guess, if you would.
It's interesting because you say that you don't see that there are clever people, as you put it. I suppose by that you mean people among our political leadership class who would be able to find an off-ramp for us that would avert this sort of catastrophe from taking place. But of course, with civil wars, historically, it's not just, you don't just need clever people to avoid them, you also need clever people to lead them, because as you write, civil wars involve very high coordination costs, and unless you have elite leadership who are giving official sanction to certain military maneuvers and certain military engagements, you really are just left with the sort of, as you describe it, lower grade sorts of civil wars that we see in places like South America. And I think another example you pick is the Russian Civil War, which is one in which you definitely do have elite leadership on both sides. You have a Bolshevik vanguard that has just conquered the Winter Palace in October of 1917. And then you have the sort of, there has been generals of the Tsarist regime who are constituting the White Army, and that becomes a very, very bloody civil war with official sanctions, with official sanctioned engagements, with military uniforms and all the rest of it. The major question that I have for you in that context, Professor Betz, is that I think roughly 75% of civil wars since 1991 have taken place along ethnic lines. You very much see our future civil war, if we have one, as taking place along those lines as well. Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations thesis has proved very prescient, it seems, since 1991 on that specific point. Who would be leading the host population of Britain, the indigenous population of Britain, in this sort of struggle? Because, of course, there remains a pretty steadfast taboo in our public and moral life that majorities, still less white majorities, are allowed to have collective interests or collective rights for which they stand up at all.
Yeah, so forgive me if I don't name names, because I don't know. I mean, it's sort of an unanswerable question. Even if, so I'm going to speak somewhat hypothetically,
Yes.
And theoretically.
Sure.
The first thing I think to look for is elite defection. As a system begins to crumble, as ours is beginning to crumble, you get elite defectors. Under normal circumstances, one of the chief bulwarks against the outbreak of civil war is the existence of a competent and unified elite. Mm-hmm. Usually, and this has traditionally been one of Britain's particular strengths. It's often remarked that Britain doesn't have a terribly great history of civil war. I mean, we have civil wars and revolts, but relative to our neighbours and other places, quite few. This is rather, relatively speaking, stable country. The thing is, though, that actually Britain has had quite a lot of little revolts, little rebellions here and there, but the British genius, really, for the last couple of centuries has been government, and the central part of that genius has been the way in which the British elite has managed to stay unified and has, relatively speaking, exhibited high degrees of governing competence. A bit like, like the Prussians have relatively high degrees of military effectiveness. They had a system for making kind of military genius irrelevant. The British have had a kind of genius for government or a system of government that has been very effective. Two factors important there that I've just mentioned are the unified nature of the elite and the competence of the elite. And I would suggest that both are neither are ways that one could describe our contemporary elite, which is fracturing in front of our eyes. You see almost on a weekly basis now the announcement of a new political movement, whether it's Advance today or Reform some time ago, and a number of other. Of course, you've got the remnants of UKIP around. You've got plenty of other of these either established or incipient movements.
Indeed.
Now, I'm not suggesting that these are the centers of revolution. In fact, quite the opposite. What I'm suggesting is this is reflective of an elite that is fracturing. So you're already seeing defections. For a more obvious example, outside of Britain of elite defection, you can point to Donald Trump or maybe a figure like Marine Le Pen. Mm-hmm. I know the German political scene a lot less well than that in the Anglo world, but I think you could point to the AfD and people and individuals who are associated with those movements who have clearly stepped out of line with the elite elite consensus. The other factor, there's elite defection. We can talk about that sensibly, I think, at two different levels, at the top and at the bottom. We tend to observe at the elite defection at the top very easily. So these are all named figures. But actually more dangerous is the elite defection at the bottom. And here, defection is probably not quite the word, because what in fact is occurring is you have a cadet generation of young people who are bright, who are ambitious, who have been trained, educated, and acculturated to expect that they would enter into the elite ranks, into the elite category, and our elite is no longer able to absorb them all. And many of them now face essentially a life of thwarted ambition. So it's not defection per se; it's failure to enter into what they thought they might they might do.
I think didn't one scholar call it elite overproduction?
That's Peter Turchin, and of course his conclusion is not dissimilar from my own about where this where this leads. So you get elite overproduction. The problem with I paraphrase Peter Turchin, but I hope I do it fairly. The problem with elite overproduction is you're producing more young, ambitious people who expect those roles than actually can be provided.
Indeed.
What happens to them? So if I was to say where is your, if I was to say an answer as to where your leadership is coming from, you would probably have some top level elite defector who is the kind of public face.
I see.
Okay.
Who we don't know yet.
That's right. I mean, in the British scene, we don't know. No. I mean, people point to Farage, but I think my personal opinion is that Farage is not a revolutionary figure in the British political scene. Quite the opposite. But anyway, people point to Farage. So it is a high-level elite defector who provides essentially the public face, you might say, the whole kind of narrative umbrella under which everybody else falls, and where effectively you get the muscle, the intellectual muscle, and the physical muscle, the energy and the networking going on. It's at that thwarted younger elite level, which now are effectively anti-status, become effectively anti-status quo. And
people who are basically being conditioned to believe that they should imbibe a strong sense of what Fukuyama would have called thumos, this idea of great spirit, but have had that spirit thwarted and feel the need to look for other outlets because they can't be absorbed by the current system, in other words.
Yes, that's right. And many young people, this is no news to anyone, many young people today feel thwarted.
Indeed. They
feel thwarted in their personal lives, in their ability to do the things that their parents did, like have stable relations. Part of being able to marry and have children and all that is being able to own a home, to have a stable place, to have a level of income. All things which, relative to one's parents, now is a rather thwarted expectation for most of elite. What I'm describing here is what in the literature is called an expectation gap. And if there's anything that the literature is really fairly agreed on, it's that expectation gaps are dangerous. So I think that the leadership is the leaders are going to arise there. There is also, though, I would add, a feeling which I think is incorrect or perhaps slightly misunderstood, is that there with these kind of outbreaks of societal rupture, call it that, right? Whether it's revolution or uprising or civil war or one of those things leading to civil war, there is an element of this which is spasmodic in its expression. It simply occurs at a point, at a very unpredictable point, where the tensions, the tinder in society has built up to such a point that it is effectively explosive. You don't know where that spark is going to take what exact form it's going to take, but the fact of the matter is, when you pile up a lot of tinder, and then it tends to find a spark, or a spark tends to find it after a certain point of time. So there is a spasmodic quality to this, and sometimes there is a vanguard quality. But the history of vanguard forces actually bringing the spasm into being is actually rather poor. It's more the case that the vanguard forces, that using a bit of jargon there, what I mean is elite leaders arise at the point it is recognized that, my goodness, here's all this pent-up energy, and it's someone who figures out how how to direct that energy. To break it down a bit further, I think for any anti-status quo movement, for any seriously anti-status quo movement, I'm trying to avoid the words revolutionary or guerrilla or whatever, but effectively it's an anti-status quo. You need passive supporters, right? These are people who are not necessarily going to do anything for you except listen or perhaps repeat your words, but maybe not much going further than that. You need active supporters. These are people who will listen and repeat and perhaps a bit more, well, actively, right? Energetically. They might also provide on a sub rosa level, provide information or protection, right? So it might be someone, say they're a county clerk, or your local librarian or something like that. These are not, like grisly guerrilla warriors. They're not militants with bandoliers and the like. But they're people who have access to resources and information, which are very, very powerful. In fact, for the most part, they're much more powerful than information is usually more powerful than muscle. So you need a group of active supporters, which is a subset of your passive supporters.
Correct.
Then you need another group, which I would call, just for purposes of for ease, call them your adherents. The adherents are people, this is a range of people, but these are people who actually do stuff. They will go out onto the street and fight, they'll blow things up, they'll become interrogators, they'll become assassins, they'll become saboteurs, whatever. So these are people, active supporters who will do physical things for you. Yes. Okay, that's a subset of your active support. And then you need your leaders. Okay, there's one other group that is relevant, and that I would call is like your prospects. Mm-hmm. Prospects are intermediate between active supporters and adherents, and these are people who have been active supporters that want to or express the desire to get involved, to become adherents, but you don't fully trust enough. Right? It's a bit like motorcycle gangs, right? If you want to join a motorcycle gang, you're a prospect for a while. You got to go and prove yourself before you're brought on as a motorcycle brother or whatever they call
whatever they are,
whatever you call yourself. So you have these categories. These they're all important. You must have if you don't have passive support, then nothing else is going to flow.
They all need each other.
If you do have passive support, then all of that could potentially flow.
I see. A quick word on how the centre-right has done on this before we get into how this war might be waged and how it might go. Indeed, if it does happen at all, is somewhat in the news at the moment. This sort of race communist rapper called Bob Vylan gave a set at Glastonbury in which he did two things that have been singled out for attention. One of them was to say death to the IDF. And the other one, of course, was to spit pretty grotesquely on the self-determination rights of the British people and to engage in what I would call a sort of replacist gloating match on stage. And I think it's notable that, with some exceptions, the centre-right has almost exclusively focused on the way in which Bob Vylan singled out the IDF for critical attention. That isn't necessarily to defend, or at all to defend, what he was saying about the IDF, but it does seem as though the British centre-right is incapable of taking its own side, and taking the side of its own people in these matters. It always feels like it needs to garble its struggle vicariously through the struggle of another military, in this case, the military of Israel. And I would venture to suggest that the IDF can probably take care of itself, but I have no idea who's going to be taking care of the British people. How do you think the centre-right came to be, in Britain, so spineless in this way?
Not to load the question.
And do you agree with me? I suppose.
I completely agree with you. Yes. So, I'm joking when I say you loaded the question. You've adequately described my point of view. I would only differ with I'm not sure I would use the term center-right for this. I think specifically we're talking about the visible right, the part of the right wing or the part of the center-right, or that part of the... Anyway, we're talking about a part of the political spectrum which under the current system happens now to have a voice. They get to go on BBC or Channel 4 or GB News or what have you. And I think that, I don't know these people personally, but it seems to me very apparent that they are extremely nervous about expressing what might be interpreted as the most mild expression of national perspective. And I don't know, because as I said, I don't know them, if this is because that is in the nature of their beliefs, that they are avowed post-nationalists, as are almost all of our political class, for example. But whether specifically those figures on the right in the media, whom we would tend to describe as conservative, are themselves post-nationalists, I don't know. But they definitely are cautious about these. And I think that is probably a reflection of their position in the power architecture.
I see.
That they probably, either they fear or they have a deeply inculcated habit of
nativist politics.
Nativist politics, of a kind of national self-abnegation as a habit, and it's intolerable. Frankly, they need to. One of the reasons that people are switching them off.
Yes.
That because it has been recognized that they're losing relevance on the conversation that people want to have, that we must have. And so much of the... So anyway, I'm just saying, I'm not sure I would call that the center-right, because I'm not sure that... it's not that I'm not sure. I don't feel that it's actually helpful with these questions to put it in a right-left dichotomy. I happen to live up north in a predominantly labor voting area. These are people who are, very animated by these problems for reasons that are perfectly obvious to every sentient Briton, unless they listen exclusively to the mainstream media. So it's not correct, I think, to put it in a left-right dichotomy. I think it's better expressed as a kind of as two competing theories of political order in the 21st century. Is it a political order based on this thing called the nation state, or is it a political order based on this idea of post-national
global governance,
whatever we're going to call this global political entity as it arises? That's the tension, and you find people on left and right who can occupy either side on that debate.
In your view, is a politics that is in Britain and in France and elsewhere in Western Europe that is explicitly oriented on the side of the host, morally permissible? Because one of the things that you have written about is how the cultural status quo is very invidiously unbalanced. That is the term you used, against the interests of host majorities, indigenous majorities, native majorities, whatever you want to call them, and radically in favor, increasingly fetishistically in favor. This is what Eric Kaufman has talked about with his whole idea of sacralized victim groups in his book, Taboo. And it seems to me that there's nothing ethnocentric as such about claiming for yourself something that you readily grant unto other people. That would be a polycentric model of national identity, which absorbs a principle of mutual recognition between different nations, and in the same way that the English have a right to England, the French have a right to France, and so it's much more polycentric than it is explicitly ethnocentric, but there is this idea that we know we need to remain sophisticated individualists, part of the tradition of England, as Alec McFarlane writes, that we do have this tradition of the origins of English individualism. This is part of our sort of cultural DNA, and it would be horrible to jettison that and embrace a kind of collectivist identity politics on behalf of the host population itself. It seems to me, though, that to push that too far is simply to invite white majorities in the Western world to commit suicide, as they are surrounded by groups that do not play by those same rules increasingly.
I think that's fundamentally true.
Okay.
The curious thing about our situation in terms of the discussion around the potentiality for civil war and why is there are a couple of most of the literature on civil wars is concerned with these kinds of wars occurring in non-Western places, right? In poorer countries, less Anglo, less democratic, so on and so forth. And there are a number of big factors that are typically pointed to as contributory to that. So when you suppose, as I do, but not exclusively, I mean, I can come back to that in a moment, why I think actually what I'm saying is not controversial at all. But what's curious about the contemporary Western situation is usually when we talk about transition countries being vulnerable to civil war, civil disorder, we're talking about countries which are transitioning from authoritarianism. Authoritarian systems are usually quite stable. I mean, there's for perfectly obvious reasons, you don't tend to get civil war in strongly authoritarian systems. Likewise, so they're transitioning from an authoritarian model to a democratic model. It's also supposed that in a functioning democratic system, you also don't tend to see civil wars because it has a functioning system for solving political problems. Yes. Collective action problems can be solved by normal politics in a democratic system. There is a strong feeling of pre-political loyalty and a perception of legitimacy, which means that on any given issue, individuals tend to say, well, I don't agree with this or that policy or this or that government, but I agree that we have a system that works fairly to aggregate people's ideas. So you have these two poles of stability on either end of the political spectrum, with the transition states being neither democratic nor authoritarian, being in the kind of sweet spot or the hot spot when it comes to potential for civil war. I'd say that the West is in that spot, but we are a transitional country, but we're transitioning from a functioning democratic system, which is good, in which politics is good at solving collective action problems, to a system that is increasingly obviously authoritarian and, moreover, unfairly or even capriciously in its application of power. So you don't know who's going to get punished for what offense. There are certain things which are offensive, but it seems to matter who you are rather than who you are rather than what you have done or not done per se. In other words, we're talking about the vaunted two-tier system, which is very much in play. So that's one curiosity of the Western situation at the moment, is this transitional status, but away from a stable regime towards a more authoritarian one, which is not yet complete. And may never be completed. I hope it doesn't be. I don't want to live in the Soviet Union or a British version of that. And neither do most people, I think. The other aspect that is curious about the Western situation is that much of what's happened over the last generation, or more than a generation actually, it's more like 2 generations, to bring this situation into being, has been an elite-driven project. At every step. If you look at election manifestos in the UK, for example, post-1945 election manifestos, both Conservative and Labour, just on their attitudes to migration. There's either no statement at all, or the kind of default political statement on both parties is we'll have managed migration.
Yes.
We're aware of people's feelings around mass migration, and we're not going to do that for you. But but as a high standard functioning economy, we're going to attract the world's best and brightest, and so on and so forth. So, dear citizens, don't worry. We're not changing things in a dramatic way. We're just building on. We're building on our strengths as a strong knowledge economy, and we're depending on you, your citizens, your natural sense of kind of welcoming and openness to other cultures, to accept a small amount of people into your country as co-citizens, so on and so forth. That's what our election rhetoric has said from 1945, but policy has gone in an entirely different direction, as I think is pretty obvious, but certainly accelerating in the last 12 years, particularly.
No doubt.
I feel there's so I mentioned why I don't think that I'm actually saying anything controversial. I'm not being naive, of course. Yes, there is controversy around this subject because it's so emotional. People are so animated about it, and the consequences are potentially so tragic. But I mean controversial in the sense of our understanding of how societies work, or our understanding of what the condition of our society is at present. There's no controversy about this. It's a very good book, written in 2013. It was probably written in 2012-11, but published in 2013 by the Oxford Don Paul Collier, called Exodus, which is an examination of the effect of migration, both on the sending countries and on the receiving countries. And in Exodus, Collier says, look, in a nutshell, mass migration is damaging both to host and to sender countries. That economically it's probably retrograde, but more importantly, it's socially retrograde. It diminishes many things about society that people like very much, like its ability to solve problems, its high levels of trust. And fundamentally, it is high levels of trust that enable people to generate wealth. If you want a rich economy, you have to have high levels of trust. If you have low levels of trust, you're going to struggle to maintain a rich economy. I'm just paraphrasing a larger book, but an idea that's been in the public sphere for 12 years. Now, Collier is very much at pains. I don't mean to misrepresent him. He's very much at pains, writing in 2013 to say, look, this is difficult. We don't want to go here because it has these problems, but I want to over dramatize it. He takes a few swipes at Enoch Powell. He's definitely not, as I am, saying, this is going to lead to violence. He's much more reluctant to go that far. Although the idea is embedded in his book. I think if an objective reader looking at that text now would see these issues. But he does say, look, mass migration, don't do it. And what happens? Yeah. What happens? They added 11 million people, or I'm going to say, let's say 11 million.
Yes.
Maybe it's only 7 to 11, something like that. And the results? Well, the results are predictable.
Yes.
And bottom line is both sides want to fight now too. You can only look at Glastonbury, scenes out of Glastonbury over the last few days, and I think that's what you're looking at is a bunch of people who are being wound up, and ultimately who do want to fight. They also want to, these are not people that think any more than I think that the normal political system is going to solve problems. You don't clap along like a seal while somebody tells the host
the
other,
yeah.
what? 80% of the country to shut the fuck up if you believe in
having a country
that works with kind of functional, normal politics.
And with that sense of pre-political loyalty that does tend to go along with a certain amount of demographic homogeneity in practice, if you really want that to be scaled up and working. If one looks at the history of civil wars as you have pretty assiduously, one notices that they're not just elite struggles, they're also games in which young men are very much at the forefront and as their sort of active support, probably more so than the passive support, but they're very, very important. And one concern that I have is that I was looking it up the other day in preparation for this conversation, and the median age of an American in the American Civil War was 19, somewhere between 19 and 20. Given that you think that our Civil War, if we have one, is going to take place along primarily ethnic and ethno-religious lines, the median age of the white British population is 43. And in fact, when one looks at age stratifications in Britain, it is our replacements, for want of a better word, who are younger, virile. They also have the British state subsidizing their livelihoods, many of them, as many as 2 million illegal immigrants in Britain who are, as I say, virile and they have more of a stake in the system, arguably, than many citizens do. And there are 10 times more of these people, upwards of 10 times more of these people than there are men enlisted in the British Armed Forces, of which there are, just as I understand it at the moment, about 85,000. Would this not be a major problem? How would the dynamics of civil war go? Would it not be a one-sided beatdown, given the age imbalance between peoples?
No, I wouldn't say it's going to be a one-sided beatdown.
Okay.
But I have to answer your question in a couple of steps. Firstly, I would go back to what I'd said earlier about the composition of a successful movement being comprised of passive and active supporters, adherents and prospects. The most it is true what you say for adherence, for muscle. If you need street fighters and the like, then absolutely yes, you need physically robust people, and that tends to be young men. Young men are both physically more robust, but they're also inclined for psychological and intellectual reasons to violence in ways that other groups are less so. Indeed. More so than older men and more so than women and at all ages. That said, the adherence is the lowest number you need. You don't need huge amounts of adherence. You need small numbers of rather committed people.
Okay.
And I don't think from that perspective, if I'm looking at a British population of, say, as I said, of total 70 million, with about 78 to 80% of that being white, I'm pretty sure that the white population is able to generate enough to satisfy the adherent requirement of a mass movement.
Which side do you think our armed forces would take in this struggle?
I think the armed forces I don't know. I think that most likely the armed forces are going to be irrelevant. They're not of sufficient size. Okay. That's actually a controversial statement. If you in the sense that most of the literature would say that the thing that matters most in terms of the outcome of revolutions is which way your army breaks. Mm-hmm. And so it is controversial if I say it. In this case, I think it's going to be irrelevant. I think at this point the army is so small. But
we're not an armed population, of course, and they would be able to crush dissent if they were inclined to do so, would they not? You tell me.
Yes, hypothetically.
Hypothetically, they would.
Hypothetically, but I wouldn't. So. The bottom line is I don't know, but I suspect that given our understanding of the demographics of the army, mm-hmm. and its ideas about
patriotic.
its ideas about itself, I feel that there is a strong likelihood that it would resist being used
in that way.
In that way against fellow citizens. On the other side, ultimately it is a very professional army, and the British Army has served in that role
In Iraq, in Afghanistan.
before, not recently. I mean, if you look back over the British Army has a strong tradition of aid to the civil power. It's one of the functions of the British Army is to be there when the state says, "Hey, I need muscle."
Yes.
And historically, one of the things that is typical of the British Army is that it has been there for the civil power. Where I would express some caution about the likelihood of that occurring again comes down to what I was saying earlier about the perception of a unified and competent elite. If the army doesn't recognize that there is a unified and competent elite, then so I think the chances are it would probably not support the government if push came to shove, which is going to leave the bottom line. Go back to what I was saying about this transition state. Britain is not it doesn't have all of the levers of power of a traditional authoritarian state. As opposed to say, look, if this was Egypt, then the president of Egypt can put 500,000 troops, not great troops necessarily, but can put 500,000 people, possibly more, onto the street overnight if they wish.
Enough to throw Mohamed Morsi into prison.
We know this is the case because we've seen the Egyptian reaction to terror attacks and the like.
Yes.
So Britain doesn't have that potential, or let alone the potential of more obvious authoritarian states like the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany, for example.
And it's likely that, as you say, highly probable that the rank and file as well might probably fall into that class of what you described earlier as elite defectors or elite checkers out, because they probably are more sympathetic to our way of viewing things. So the rank and file, maybe not the generals, but the rank and file. Yeah. So the army.
There's. I tried to explain. Maybe I should have done this earlier, but I think there are two. There are two, sometimes I describe them as vectors or two levels of the conflict which I expect to arise. One is essentially in the character of a revolt against, or specifically of a peasant revolt, i.e. a conservative. Peasant revolts are essentially conservative in their character. It's a response that tends to occur in a population where elites are seen to have changed the rules of the game in some way. Yes. And so on one level, it will look like a peasant revolt, and that I think is likely to have to feature the kind of dirty war aspects that I mentioned. Of course, you can speculate on who the figures might be, which sort of figures might be targeted, but from the example of other cases, it tends to be essentially members of the power elite, particularly the lesser guarded or the more public facing of the power elite. So judges, prominent lawyers, some politicians, but politicians tend to be relatively more guarded. Media figures, I think, would be in the frame because that again, just drawing from parallel experience in other countries. The other is essentially the intertribal or the interethnic, and it's a reflection of, well, you mentioned Glastonbury. It's a reflection of that. You want your country back, shut the fuck up. Those are the two camps, okay? It's I want my country back, and you shut the fuck up. Find people that align themselves with either one of those statements, and I think you'll pretty much have mapped out who is on what side in the intertribal or interethnic conflict. That's the one that I fear is going to metastasize and would particularly have this rural-urban dynamic that I talked about.
I was just about to speak about the rural-urban dynamic. People might intuitively believe that the cities would have an advantage over the countryside because they have more people, they presumably have more resources, they can call upon more in the way of knowledge and information and all that sort of thing. The countryside, by contrast, strikes us as more isolated, more sort of sprawled about. But you actually think that there would be a number, let's say that this civil war were to take place not along inter-ethnic lines that were also by extension in geographical terms rural versus urban. You think that the people living in rural communities would have quite a significant tactical advantage, particularly when it comes to targeting key infrastructure?
Yes, I think so. Now again, in this case, there is a bit of technical controversy as well, because about what I'm saying, because in the past, urban populations have been able to subdue the rural areas. So if you look at you mentioned earlier the Russian Civil War.
Indeed, yes.
The Bolsheviks were able to mobilize urban militias to go out into the countryside and essentially to extract resources that were required by the cities to sustain themselves for long enough and successfully enough to subdue
the White Army.
The White Army, and to ultimately to establish the so-called permanent revolution, right? And so the controversy now is suggesting that maybe that's not going to work. And I think for my part, my impression or my views on this are very much influenced by reading of the urban studies literature. In the urban studies literature, now for quite a long time, for going back at least 50 years, you'll have people in the urban studies literature talking about essentially the way that the modern city has developed as being an astonishing but actually very perilous balancing act, and that. And so sometime in between the early 20th century in the incipient Soviet Union and end of the first quarter in the 21st century, I think that the rural-urban dynamic has changed in ways that increase the vulnerability of the intrinsic vulnerability of cities to disruption.
Yes.
The theory behind this is pretty well developed. I didn't invent it. It's usually referred to as system disruption. Mm-hmm. It's most associated with an American fellow named John Robb, who wrote a book or runs a website called Global Guerrillas. But his book from the mid-2000s was called Brave New War. And the theory of system disruption is pretty obvious, that you use fundamentally sabotage, but other sorts of actions that are designed to disrupt the normal functioning of a complex system, which cause that system to kludge up or, in fact, to just tear itself apart. And actually, that's not a new idea. It's a basic idea of sabotage. But his point in writing this in 2006 was based on the premise that for reasons to do with the complexification of human society in the period we are now, that technique is particularly powerful.
Indeed. Talking about, to be specific, like blowing up bridges and that sort of thing.
Yeah, so whether it's...
Supply
it could be a bunch of things. Now, to come to my... contribution to this, which is simply to observe two things. One is the pattern, the demographic pattern. So if you do a map of the country based on the places where migrant populations go, you'll see that that's almost all concentrated in the cities. In Britain, in a handful of cities. Likewise in France. Another very kind of illustrative map is look at the electoral map of the most recent French Europarliamentary elections, where you see that Le Pen's was it the National Movement, National Rally, essentially wins all of the rural and smaller centers, and you have a big dot on Paris and a couple of other islands which went the other way. So you have a very obvious suggestion of a rural-urban dynamic just by looking at the pattern of
voting,
patterns of migration and voting.
Yeah.
Secondly, you look at the infrastructure. Where is the infrastructure located? Like urban infrastructure. So a city, by definition, if you think of like the most basic definition of a city that satisfies the requirements of describing all of the many sorts of cities that have existed in history, is a community which cannot feed itself on its own, essentially on its own resources. It has to draw in resources in order to sustain itself. That's the most basic definition of cities. So the life support system, the critical life support system for these big urban cities, which are under normal circumstances this balancing act, is all located outside of the cities. It's almost all unguarded. And it's very difficult to guard because of the way it's distributed and the kinds of things. It's very big and it's spread all over the country, and it's also basically vulnerable. I mean, if you think of a gas compression station, for example, there's a big bomb. The gas network is composed of things called major accident hazard pipelines. The clue is in the name. These are just naturally explosive. Under normal conditions, this doesn't matter. Like a normally functioning society doesn't need to guard every piece of infrastructure because nobody would attack it. But that puts a lot of weight on these two words, normally functioning. And in a non-normally functioning or an abnormally functioning society, those things become admirable targets.
To conclude, you write, it is impossible to maintain an integrated multivalent society once neighbours start kidnapping each other's children and murdering them with hand drills, blowing up each other's cultural events, slaying each other's teachers and religious leaders, and tearing down their icons. Crucially, you add, it is soberingly worth noting, moreover, that plenty of instances of all those things have occurred already in the West, and all of them have occurred in France alone in the last 5 years. What must be done policy-wise to avert civil war at this stage? We're already on a very dangerous, you think, war path. Is there any way of getting off it, in short?
I think it would be very easy for us to sit down with a piece of paper and figure out what must be done to avert this. We've just meant the threats are obvious. The fractures are perfectly obvious now. The problem is you can come up with those solutions on a piece of paper, and there is zero political will to enact any of them. There is no political figure. There is no political off-ramp for this. That the situation is moving at a rate of knots. That I think it is very unlikely that our whole power elite is able to keep up with. So things are going to, in realistic terms, in politically realistic terms, therefore, there isn't a solution. There isn't a political off-ramp.
We may have to brace ourselves then. Professor David Betz, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.